Hey fearsome friends, today I have some dark and disturbing stories from Reddit's Nosleep. Although they are fiction, a good story is a good story, and the imagination is a wonderful tool. So sit back, get cozy, comfy, warm, and sink into the realm of scary. Blindly, I'll always somehow find myself at my grandmother's little inn, which is down the road from my sweet little coast-bound house up here in Connecticut. I'm here over the summer break to help out with all the guests flooding their way into Fairsville, and it's not like I'll have her forever, so I try to make the best of the time she has left. And if you knew why I loved the place so much, you'd travel near and far just to get a look at it. The inn is small, nothing special from the outside. Hell, it doesn't even have its own name. Grandma didn't even want to put a name up at first, saying it wouldn't feel as homelike as she'd want. But I convinced her otherwise after a week without having anybody to serve. I wasn't going to see my dear grandma upset, so I offered to put it up myself, and she obliged, thankful she didn't have to do it herself. However, sadly, she still felt wary over the idea. The inside of the place is what'll kill you. Cramped, yes, but does it feel like a place you'd want to lay your head? I think so. There is great warmth that comes from the grand fireplace in the corner where she used to settle up heaving pots of cocoa for me and my many siblings. The furniture is very outdated, but what guest wouldn't want to get an aesthetic picture up in front of all these wonderful decorations that they'll get praise for, not caring about the strict photography rule, that is. You see, Grandma has many rules. It feels as though they have only been created to suit her own needs, and not that of the workers or patrons. But hey, I guess if it works for her, then that's all that matters. But beside the ruckus these rowdy adults can cause, that's not what I find the most unsettling. Now the kitchen. I've always had a strong hatred for it, and I haven't exactly noticed why that feeling was off since a week or so ago. This story will sadly start with one of my favourite mouth-watering delicacies, courtesy of my grandma, and that's her biscuits. I mean, damn, these things used to make me warm to the core at the thought of them, as they were silky layers, crisp from all the butter folded into them. Grandma tried to show me and my family how to make them, but even today it seems impossible. The technique is difficult, making me wonder how this little Italian lady, prone to being impatient, can even handle it. Must be the end product that drives her, I guess. However, I feel they've lost something over the years. Don't get me wrong, I'll eat anything thrown in front of me. But these, I can barely stomach them nowadays. How could they have decreased in their flavour? Grandma was a perfectionist, and she would kill any of us if we even tried to claim our biscuits were the same. Too little salt, don't be afraid of flavour. I can still hear her yelling that at my poor father, not wanting to make his pastry taste like what dough was left on the pan after serving. It was around the time when the biscuits went wrong that the kitchen and fireplace began to, shall we say, reek, particularly of death. It would smell like decaying animals, much like the ones my father used to hang up across the porch after finding them out on the road. In his mind, they were cool decorations. I know, weird. My family does have some odd habits that I've noticed. And no, this story isn't about him. It got to a point where guests began to complain, demanding for refunds after little less than a night's stay at the place. Grandma got these air diffusers, washing out much of the smell for the people who would sleep there for the night on their travels. But it was worse for me. She didn't put any fresheners in the kitchen, so my nose was constantly clogged by the smell, making me grow sick. Grandma didn't seem to notice at all, and would just carry on with her daily routine. It actually felt like she wanted me to be ill. Everything felt wrong. I should have caught on by then that Grandma wasn't the honest, kind lady that she was portrayed to be. No one had caught on, and no one could have known of the horrors that she had accomplished in one tiny closet. The closet. God, the closet. Grandma used to send me there as punishment when I'd take too much from the guests' little buffet, or hit my siblings if they angered me. I'd be in there for hours, staring up at all the spices and sugars. The thought of them toppling over and cracking into my skull never left my poor 11-year-old mind. She obviously can't do anything like that now as I'm older, but the memories still haunt me to this day. She almost worries about me looking in there nowadays, adding to almost each task that involved me entering the kitchen alone with, "My dear, please don't enter the closet without Grandmama's permission. We don't want anything falling on you." Now she worries about things falling on me. How about when I was 6, climbing up half the thing before I was caught, almost crashing to the floor? I lost a bit of respect for her then, but my mind was washed. Biscuits, fresh out of the oven. I couldn't help myself, dissolving deep into the layers of butter and crispy edges, burning a hole in the worried thoughts. It was like some sort of drug, blinding me from the truth of how shady it all was. Looking back, everything about her was shady, even down to her very nickname that got her so loved by guests. Grandmama. That's what she would call herself. It made her look sweeter to people, now that I think about it. I remember my little cousin repeating to her the name at age 3, unable to grasp that that was not what the rest of us called her. She took on the name, forcing all of us to call her it in her presence. It was sweet, but the name was awkward to say. When I was trying to talk about my family to friends while there, I remember being 9, trying to impress some girls I had become acquaintances with, when out comes Grandma, a tray of her fine pie on her head, shouting, "Grandmama is here, dears, come get some Grammy pie." I almost couldn't forgive her for it, but hey, Grammy pie is not something you could turn down. With my surprise, I somehow made it to the point where these people were my friends. It was an absolute score. But listen to me, I've been rambling on. I should really get on to why I'm here. I've seen bodies. Hundreds of them, it seems. You see, a couple of months ago, I decided to take a peek inside the forbidden closet. I just got too curious. However, what I found nearly sent me to the floor. There were bodies. Human bodies. The spice cabinet must have been taken out years ago for space to do whatever the hell this was. Sickened, I remember slamming the door before planting myself to the ground, trying my hardest not to vomit from the smell. That was the worst of it. Think of rancid, musty old meat you'd find in the bottom of your freezer, left to sit in its own juices until you had finally decided to remove it. Since that first encounter with the dead, I can't count them anymore. They pile up each time I go to this damn closet to check on them. I remember there being 15 the last time I counted, stacked up on each other like some sort of crude Jenga tower. I can't even describe them as bodies anymore, really. They look like badly superglued pieces of burnt bones stacked into each other, making badly made skeletons. They looked deformed, like ones Miss Smith used to put out. The props Mr. Jackson had splintered into fragments after a hit to her tree with his old John Deere. So this is where the smell was coming from. Those poor people had been most likely cooked in the massive stone pizza oven she has out back, which is powerful enough to only take off the flesh and skin, leaving the badly scorched bones of our once happy travellers. It had to be happening at night, the peak time for Grandma to start on her famous biscuits, and it had to be some sort of lie. Instead of buttering biscuits, she was butchering bodies. Now I regret my next action to this day. Shakily getting up from the ground, I decided to search around the containers that sat around the room. Everything seemed normal with them. The sugars thin and grainy, the butter sitting out on the counter in its cute little dish, and the spices all at a perfect grind. But bile swarmed to my mouth as I reached the flour. This was not flour, but ashes. They smelt too similar to that closet to not be. Then I realized something. I had been eating the remains of dead patrons for the past year, and I hadn't known it. Patrons who disrespected her and the establishment must have gotten on Grandma's nerves, forcing her to go on this spree. Her rules. These poor people sentenced to death for not following stupidly put together rules. I might have felt slightly better if I hadn't eaten anything from her. I didn't consume much of the pastries, only the fresh beef and beans she had crafted up the money for a while back when business began to boom. Ever since then, she's been putting up more expensive, lighter meals for her guests. But hey, who couldn't love a family recipe? They'd buy it either way. She knew the appeal. But there was one thing I had eaten that I'm sure had said ashes in it, and I'm sure you can guess what that is. Yeah, the biscuits. I've seen her every day after classes, scooping the flour from that old china pot that Grandpa had gotten her years ago, and out into the old stand mixer. I thought because of the poor candlelight that she preferred over actual lamps, that was the reason for its off-colouring. But now I realised how very wrong I was. They looked like ashes you'd see in a little vase after a family member had been cremated. And I've sadly seen a few of those, as my family is notoriously prone to illness. But that doesn't matter now. I had been eating innocent people, and my grandma was getting away with it. I should call the police and have them come fly her away to a life sentence, but I just can't. This is the lady that has brought me up into the lovely person I am now, and I just can't do it. It would feel wrong. So I've decided to keep it a secret. I hope this reaches the right people on Reddit though, so I'm warning you now, that with whatever you do in life, please, for the love of God, if you are ever finding yourself up the winding streets in the town of Fairsville on some sort of visit, and my grandma's inn is the only option, which hopefully it isn't by what I've told you, I warn you to mind your manners around my dear grandma if you happen to stay at her said to be warm and welcoming inn. You may find yourself in the next biscuit that I'll have to consume. Now please, hear me out before you judge me. I'm just a perpetually broke millennial with a second-rate business degree from a third-rate college, trying her best to make it until tomorrow. I lost both my parents 2 months ago, and inherited a delinquent mortgage on a house I hate, and a flea shop which wasn't paying those bills. Don't send condolences. I wasn't close with them, and it seems, based on all the crap they left to me to sort out, that this was all one final middle finger to me. God, they're dead and gone, and how the hell are they still stressing me out? So yeah, I'm trying to sell the shop, but in this economy, nobody's buying. In the meantime, I decided to use my business degree to at least break even on the rent and maybe make enough for a cup of coffee now and again. So I thought, what do people need? Clothes. My first bright idea. I mean, everyone wears clothes. Poor, rich, old, young. Everybody needs them. So I moved some of the antique porcelain bird feeders and carved voodoo sticks. Seriously, what are these things? Into the back room and put out some racks for more clothes. I had my second bright idea sitting on the toilet, fiddling with my fingers, having forgotten my phone on the charger. Dead people don't need clothes, and my business brain put 2 and 2 together, and suddenly I had coffee money and then some. See, my plan was to buy clothes for pennies on the dollar from people who had just kicked the can, may they rest in peace, and sell them on, for cheap, to people who still had mouths to feed. I honestly thought that this plan was ingenious. Still do, really. I'm just a little bit unnerved after everything that's happened. So I went to hospitals and morgues and fielded a lot of people who told me to go to hell. I oversold my sob story and put on my best helpless puppy face, and by the end of the week I had a sizable collection of clothes. Some donated, some bought, but all scalped from the families of dead people. And you know, some people practically shoved this stuff into me. Like so many of these clothes were just too much to deal with emotionally. What's a husband going to do with his wife's favourite summer dress now that she's gone? A couple lost their only son. Great. Now they have size 3 kids' shoes and no feet to wear them. I was doing them a favor, taking this stuff off their hands. These people died, and there's no use crying every time you pick up your dead husband's lucky tie. I gathered all these clothes, washed them, of course, arranged them nicely on the racks, and then hosted a little grand reopening for the shop. A few weeks in and I was actually doing quite well for myself. Word spread that this was the place to get cheap clothes, high quality too. I didn't tell anyone where I'd got them, but hey, nobody asked. But it's about then when things started to get weird. I didn't notice it at the time, but it makes sense now. See, every now and then things would just be out of place. Nothing major, and definitely nothing that would raise a red flag, but small things. A voodoo stick left out on the floor. Maybe I had accidentally knocked it there. A porcelain bird feeder shattered one morning. Maybe it had fallen during the night. Small things that you can explain away, because, well, you just have to explain them away. There's no other reasonable option. Small things that only make sense because of what comes next. It took me maybe another week before I noticed the display mannequins and how they would always change position. It was subtle at first, like an arm which I could have sworn I had bent so that it touched the hip, now suddenly hung limply at the mannequin's side, or white plastic heads turned ever so slightly more, as if to look at something. At me. And then I stayed late one night to redo the inventory and clean up a little bit. It must have been well past 11 p.m, because I was already thinking about which bottle of wine I'd open up when I got back. The Chardonnay, 2016 vintage, of course. I was just closing up shop, and having locked up and turned off the lights in the front, I was ready to head out the back. Then I heard a crash. Something had fallen. And then came the clack, clack, clack. Footsteps. But it couldn't be. I had locked up, hadn't I? Maybe a customer had come in, but I hadn't heard the bell. Either way, I wasn't about to go check it out. Instead, I inched closer to the back door, pulling out my cell phone as I did. Hello? Who's there? No reply. I waited there, breathing heavily and fumbling with my phone to try to dial 911. 1 minute, 2 perhaps. Then I called again. Is anyone there? Nothing. Did I imagine it? I must have. Only right then, as I slipped the phone back into my purse, I heard it again. It was unmistakable this time, and louder, coming from just outside the door to the back room, still hidden in the impenetrable darkness which lay beyond. Clack, clack, clack. I shrieked, "Stay back or I'm calling the cops." I fumbled for my phone, ready to bolt out the door at any moment. And when the arm came poking through the door, I did just that. I dropped my phone and my purse and just got the hell out of there. I can still picture it. That pale white arm of a mannequin sliding out of the darkness. Shiny and white and inhuman, yet somehow it moved. Like butter, it slipped out of the darkness, a hand outstretched, reaching for something, and I didn't stay to find out what. I ran down the street past a dark row of shops long closed for the night. I didn't look back, didn't slow down. I swore I could hear clack, clack, clack still behind me. Plastic breath down the back of my neck and a hand so smooth and white reaching out, grabbing me to drag me back into the darkness of that accursed shop. But nothing like that happened, thank God. I made it down a couple of blocks to the first shop that was still open, a fast food joint with one customer slobbering over a burger. I huffed incoherently to the cashier and I cried, and they must have thought I was crazy, but they still dialed 911, and only when the red-blue lights came flooding through the glass did I feel safe. I let the cop go in first. All I said was there had been someone in the shop. Didn't tell them anything about the mannequin, or the hand, because though I knew without a shadow of a doubt what had happened, I knew it was crazy too. So the cop goes in. The front doors are still locked, so he goes in the back. I see his flashlight poking out the front display windows, sweeping methodically around. I should have mentioned where the light switch was. My mistake. The light's sweeping down each aisle and then, all of a sudden, it isn't. The flashlight's gone. No sound, no nothing. And then he shouts, a deep bellow tinged with real terror. His partner tells me to stay put and then runs in, gun drawn, flashlight out, and as he does he radios for backup. I see his flashlight sweeping, again so methodically, aisle by aisle, until it hangs still and then blasts the silhouette of a man onto the front display windows. A man just standing there, unmoving and facing away from me. I'm so tempted to run at this point, but where would I go? It's all instinct. Save yourself. Go anywhere. Anywhere but here because it isn't safe. But I could hear sirens in the distance coming closer every second, and I know that if I can just wait a little longer, I should be fine. Right? Strength in numbers after all. Before backup arrives though, both officers burst through the front doors, one of them almost carrying the other. The other cop, the cop who went in first, he's bone white, like porcelain, like plastic. His face is frozen midway into a scream, and he can barely move. I can tell that his partner is struggling underneath his weight. They both collapse onto the ground, and his partner radios for EMTs as well. The man then screams at me to come help, elevate his partner's head so as to begin CPR. I hesitate, because whatever did this might still be inside the shop. But he calls out again and I hear so much desperation in his voice that how could I not? So I run over and kneel on the cold winter pavement to angle up a cold, stone-like head as he starts CPR. I cradle this cop's head with my hands and it's so cold. Too cold. Like the pavement. How could he still have been alive? But he was. Finally, 2 more squad cars pulled up and 4 officers, guns already drawn, come over and head into the shop. The lights go up, the officers come out, there's no one inside, and the rest is a blur. But eventually one of the officers asks me if I can head inside to see if anything was stolen. Apparently though, there were no signs of forced entry. They believe there was a man inside who had managed to escape out the back. A thief most likely. And as for the officer on the ground, the official ruling is heart attack. But we both know better. Because when I stepped inside, almost everything was the same. Only the mannequin by the door had changed. It had moved from the racks near the back to its new spot by the entrance. It was still wearing a flowery yellow sundress, but its white plastic arm was cruelly outstretched, hand cupped as if to grasp some phantom object, or just maybe to wrap around a human neck. That officer and I both knew what we saw, but who could we tell? Who would believe us? The shop was closed for a couple of days after that. When I finally got the nerve to head back, the mannequin was still by the entrance, hand still outstretched, and still clad in its yellow flowery sundress. I came at high noon with a hand axe tucked away in my purse, and with startling efficiency to the backdrop of streaming sunlight, I hacked each mannequin to pieces and tossed the plastic shards into the dumpster out back. For the most part, things went back to normal after that. People seemed to quickly forget that my shop had closed mysteriously for that week. And if anyone asked, I told them it was all for a routine cleaning, and no one questioned it. But somehow that made them cheerier. It's now been more than a month since all of this happened, and I've come to repress a lot of this experience, and rationalize what can be rationalized and forget what I can't. But I'm writing this now because something strange just happened again. I just unpacked a box of new additions to the clothing section, and I pulled out this yellow flowery dress. But I had sold it months ago. I remember because I practically gave it out for free to anyone willing to take it. I had sold it. Yet here it is again. My name is Aaron, I'm a 36-year-old man who weighs 226 pounds. I'm the strongest man in the gym that I go to, and I live in an apartment on the 4th floor of the safest apartment building in the city, with 2 of my closest friends. There are locks on all the doors and windows, and security guards patrol the area 24 hours a day. There are cameras on every doorbell, and in every hallway and staircase in the building. And I sleep in the corner of a mostly empty room, on a bed with no underside. There is no closet in the room, and there is generally enough light so you can see anything in the dark. But, despite all this, I still sleep with a nightlight. Now, before you judge me too much, I have a reason for doing this, and I figured out that reason the first day I moved here. My friends and I just moved out of a cheaper apartment complex on the southern part of the city. We moved to this one so that we could be closer to our workplaces. No, we don't work at the exact same place, though we do work at places close together. I'd say we were pretty well off. Rent was split 3 ways and we made a decent amount of money. And this new apartment was an absolute steal, considering the fact that there's so much security. You'd think we'd be suspicious on how it was so cheap, or why there was so much security. Well, we soon found out that the security wasn't there to keep things out. They were there to keep things in. Now, this apartment wasn't anything special, just a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom. Of course there was a kitchen and a living room, but that was about it. We could pay our bills on time without much of a problem, though sometimes I did have to work overtime. It was a nice break from our 2-bedroom apartment that we had before, and luckily for us, our neighbours seemed kind enough, though they seemed somewhat sympathetic, which was odd. Anyway, we unpacked our stuff on that first day as if it was just a normal apartment, which at the time we thought it was. We all took our own rooms, and I opted for the one without a closet. I never did like spiders, and closets are the main source of them. After we had unpacked, we went out to dinner, and on our way out the security guard said some strange things. He told me that we should all invest in some nightlights, 1 for every room. When we asked why, he said there were things living in there that wouldn't go near light. He suggested we go to an old lamp shop and ask them for their finest nightlights. We laughed it off, but wondered what he meant. What things? Did the apartment have rats? Man, how I wish the apartment had rats. We spent the rest of the evening out at a bar, drinking and having fun. We all had a blast. It was about 7:39 when we returned to the apartment. I was planning on staying up late watching some TV, and when we got to the front doors and the guard asked us what apartment we were staying in. We told him the number and he asked us if we were the new residents. We said yes, and then he asked us if we had bought any nightlights. When we told him no, he said the same thing as the first guy. This was the second time we heard the warning, and it was from a different guy. Being the stupidly drunk idiots we were, we ignored him and just went back to the apartment. When we got there, all the lights were off, yet it wasn't even close to pitch black. It seemed as if there were small artificial lights on the ceiling, even though there weren't. We all knew that lighting was unnatural. It was like a blue glow, and it lit all the room equally, something windows could never do. When we turned the lights back on, it dispersed, and we didn't think much of it. We all headed off to do our different things, and I locked myself in my room. Now, a thing to note is that each room has its own separate TV. The TV did emit light, but not an extreme amount, and I don't think it cared about TV light. I turned on the TV and started watching, and after a while I turned the normal lights off, as it was kinda hurting my eyes. When I did, the blue haze slowly returned, but I thought nothing of it. I didn't think anything strange about the movement in the unnatural light, and I didn't think anything strange of the shadowed figure lying at the edges of the room. I was in for a hell of a night. After a while I noticed something odd. Were the walls closer to me than they were before? Was my door always on that side of the room? Did that shadowy figure always exist there? I concluded the answer to the last one was no. Well, I didn't have to conclude. As the second I laid my eyes on it, it jumped. It swiftly moved towards my bed, and I was terrified. I screamed as it punched on my chest, knocking the wind out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe. It started bashing at my shoulders, and by the time the guards came in, I think one of my shoulders was almost broken. I was taken to a hospital, and was there for a few days before returning to the apartments. When the guards suggested that we get those nightlights again, you bet that we listened. It turns out that my 2 roommates had had a similar experience. Figures that were there, it seems that there was a different one in each room, and over time I learnt that my creature was the most aggressive of them all. Without a dark closet or shady corner to hide in, it was barely allowed in the physical realm. Surprisingly enough though, the one in the bathroom was quite friendly. He was the one that got the most time and enjoyed our presence. Sometimes we would leave the light off so that we wouldn't bother him. According to one of my roommates, his ghost was better than mine, talking first and then beating him. Well, they aren't exactly ghosts, more like demons or something. We lived in peace for about 3 years, happy and healthy lives. But little did we know that was about to change. One day out of the blue, all the lamp shops in town burned to the ground. Now it wouldn't have been so suspicious if it had happened on different days or even times, but no. It was exactly 6:54 p.m. Every lamp shop in town burnt down. Nothing the firefighters did could stop the fires, and nobody in the buildings survived. The firefighters think it was a coordinated attack from arsonists, but there wasn't any evidence of humans getting involved. In fact, it seemed as if after 3 p.m. every security camera in town stopped working, even the ones in our apartment complex. We, like many others, went down to check out what happened, but somehow it seemed like the guards were unfazed, almost in a monotone type way. When we got back it was about 7:31, and every light in the house was smashed, destroyed, even the night lights. We walked into the apartment, momentarily forgetting the demons, and that's when they struck. First, the living room one shut the door and locked it. It used its telekinesis to move the couch in front of the door, then turned to us. It pushed us across the apartment, effectively splitting us up. But luckily for me, I was pushed into the bathroom. I hid in there and locked the door. The ghost in there asked me what was going on. I told him everything. He said he never liked those other demons, always hating everything else for not getting exactly what they wanted. The screams of my roommates went on for some time, maybe about an hour or 2. At this point, I've lost all sense of emotion. I've used it all up in the past day. All I can assume now is that my friends are dead, and all I can hope for is that they can't enter other rooms. The banging started a few hours ago. At first it wasn't much, just like a slight knock. Then it was like a hurricane bashing on the door, waiting to come in and devour me. Now listen, I didn't come here because I was a hero and saved myself somehow. I'm still trapped in that bathroom with the hurricane going on outside. It won't be long before they get in and kill me, or do whatever they did to my friends. I fear that they've learnt how to get past the guards and cameras, and I fear that's how the lamp shops were burnt. I fear that they will soon roam the entire globe. So all I present to you now is one piece of advice. If you see that soft blue fog, turn on a light and buy some night lights, and never turn them off. Have you ever had a nightmare that was so real and horrifying? Not only that, but also felt like you've lived endless years in that hellish nightmare. And when you jolt awake, it can sometimes take hours to convince yourself that what you thought were years of real terror was only a nightmare that happened in a span of 3 to 4 hours. Well, that used to be a nightly routine for me. Right from early middle school and continuing on until I graduated from high school. But the thing about some of my nightmares was that sometimes when I would abruptly wake, awake from them. It was like the nightmare was still happening, but I was alert and fully awake. Back when I was around the age of 15, I was laying in bed while listening to the intense thunderstorm raging on outside. I stared at the single window in my room directly across from my bed, watching the bright flashes of lightning seep through the cracks of my closed blinds and thinned curtains. I was waiting for the sleeping pills that I had just started taking to help me in deep dreamless sleep to kick in. Within minutes, I was feeling the effects of the pills, and just as I was about to fall asleep, I remember praying that I wouldn't have a nightmare. Dazed and confused, I found myself standing in a clearing in a forest, looking around at the massive trees that encircled me. But at some point I felt this overwhelming, horrible feeling, like something was watching me. It was almost like something's gaze was burning holes into my back, and for some reason, even though all my instincts were screaming at me not to, I slowly turned to look back. To my horror, standing only a few yards away from me, was what I can only describe as half a man, half a deer creature. And I know it sounds silly, but this creature was at least 4 feet taller than I was, and had the head of a bulkier looking deer, with 2 black, thick, long curved horns protruding from both sides of its head. It had the torso of a human male, and the long burly hoofed legs of a deer. And for a moment I stood frozen in fear, unable to tear my gaze away from its black, lifeless eyes. But at some point something inside me screamed danger, freeing me from staring any longer into those unnerving eyes, and I quickly turned around and ran as fast as I could. As I was running though, I could hear the hoofs of this creature getting louder, and I could feel the earth beneath my feet tremble as it grew closer and closer. And just when I felt like it was directly behind me, I felt as though everything started to go in slow motion. Maybe 10 feet to my right, I saw a tiny wooden cabin nestled between 2 large dead trees, and standing in the doorway of the cabin was a small, frail old lady who was hunched over and pointing directly at me with her grotesque, bony finger. Even though we were over 10 feet away from each other, I could still hear her soft, raspy voice say, "He's in your room." Confused and panicked, I was about to scream for help when I suddenly felt a powerful tremble under my feet and could hear the sound of hoofs slamming into the earth directly behind me. Overcome with anxiety, I knew he was about to catch me. And at that moment, I abruptly sat straight up in my bed, hyperventilating. And you would think that at that moment I would feel a flood of relief. But the second I sat straight up in bed, I was met with a bright flash of lightning illuminating my room, and the first thing to enter my sight was the curtain on my window, which I could tell had been moved. The upper middle section of it was now dipping downwards, while the bottom of my curtain, that was supposed to be bundled up and tucked in at the bottom of my blinds, was partially hanging over the upper middle part of my curtain that was dropping down. It now resembled the outline of the head of the creature in my nightmare. And just like my nightmare, I had that god-awful feeling that something was watching me, and recalled the old woman's raspy voice say, "He's in your room." I was hit with both a wave of realization and anxiety all at once, and while I was overwhelmed with the sense of being watched, the realizations and the anxiety was reaching my limit. Just then I saw a black figure start to materialize in front of my curtain, followed with the sound of the old woman's raspy voice, laughing at first, but it was growing louder and sounding deeper in tone. At that point I think I hit my breaking point, because all I can remember after that was sprinting out of my room and into what I call my safe space, which was the bathroom at the time. Locking the door and sitting in a ball in the bathtub, I ended up having one of my worst panic attacks, which ended up with me disassociating, because I don't really remember the rest of that night. I guess I kinda snapped out of it when my sister was banging on the bathroom door, angry that I was in there for so long. Honestly, I have so many other stories like this one, but I don't think I'm really ready to go back over those moments, which I consider to be one of my most traumatic points in my life. Hi everybody, my name is Sid, and I'm an addict. It took me a long time to accept that, but when you take a job in a casino just so that you can be there all the time and try to gain an edge, you're an addict. It's obvious even to me, and more so to my family and friends, who I barely see anymore. It's not pills or coke or booze or heroin that I'm hooked on. I'm addicted to gambling. And the casino that made me so obsessed is not an ordinary one. It's far from ordinary. You don't play for money at Fantasy Casino. You play for your dreams. I hear you laughing, but have you ever had a really, really great dream? One that got so good you snapped awake the second it started to get really excellent. Well, imagine that times 1,000, times 1,000,000. A dream so real and so perfect that all of your fantasies become reality. Time stretches out. You feel like you are there forever, and a lifetime passes before your return. Infinite wealth, the ability to fly like Superman. You're surrounded by sex and beautiful people all day as you relax in a palace built to your mind's most exacting specifications of perfection. But then you wake up, and in an instant it is gone. The power, the wealth, the endless sex and supernatural powers, and everything is suddenly normal again. This is what makes you go back to the casino, and I went back to the casino. Now the problem with gambling is that you don't always win, and when you lose, suddenly the winnings are gone as well, vanished without a trace. All I knew was that I had to have that feeling again. So I went inside the giant building and then followed the secret signs which led to a door that led to a staircase going down. I went down the stairs and knocked on the door marked private and waited for an answer. "Password," the voice on the other side of the black door said, waiting for my response. "Seramth Jin." Carefully and deliberately I said these unnatural words, still not knowing their meaning. A friend had told me the password. A fellow gambler who I would later find dead in his apartment. His corpse white, bloated and maggot-infested. His eyes were black and filled with blood which streamed from his eye sockets like tears. He'd bitten his tongue clean off, and his fingernails were found lodged in various surfaces throughout his apartment, like he had been trying to claw his way out of a steel box that only he could see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That came later. At this point I was still hopeful for another wonderful dream, still thankful for his advice to seek out the place. The door finally opened and I walked inside. It was the same as it had been the day before, only less busy at this time, as it was still early afternoon. I approached the table I had been sitting at the night before. A huge sign read, "Poker, Texas Hold'em, 10 Dream Limit." The rules were simple. You got a stack of chips. If you doubled them, you received a dream. If you lost them, you lost a dream. I wasn't concerned about losing dreams yet, as I still didn't understand exactly what it meant. When I lost my first stack of chips, I quickly bought in again, and again, and again. Pretty soon I realized I had lost 8 dreams with no winnings whatsoever. I was in a slump, a losing streak. I decided to go home and count my losses. Literally, since I had no idea what that even meant. As I got up to leave the table, the dealer looked at me. His eyes were remorseless and cold. "See the cashier on your way out," he said, handing me 8 black chips. I gulped and walked over to the glass window where the cashier sat waiting. Handing him the 8 chips, he raised his eyebrows and clicked his tongue. "That's a shame. Hold out your hand, please." 2 men in black suits came up behind me, suddenly, and stood on either side of me, intimidating in their stature and demeanor. I did as he asked and held out my hand with the palm facing up. The cashier pulled out a strange-looking device from beneath the counter. It had a vial of vermilion-coloured liquid at the top that was attached to the rest of it, which resembled a gun with a hypodermic needle at the end. I screamed and tried to pull away, but the 2 men grabbed me and held my arm through the window. Thrashing and elbowing them, I tried to get away, but it was useless. The cashier injected the stuff into my veins quickly, and it felt cold and slimy as it coursed through my system. I could feel it enter my heart, turning it cold and into my lungs, then up into my mind, all extremities causing me to shake violently and seize. I writhed on the floor, blood pouring from my ears and my eyes. Finally, the feeling settled down into a numbness that prickled the insides of my blood vessels. It then wasn't until later, once I'd realized what the casino really was, that I found out what they had done. I went home with the certainty that they had injected me with something. If winning had resulted in the greatest dream I ever had, essentially an almost never-ending fantasy, then what would happen after a loss? Nightmares. That's what it would be, I was sure of it. I settled into bed that night and closed my eyes, drifting off to sleep quickly after such an emotionally exhausting afternoon. As soon as my eyes closed, they opened again, and it was morning. It felt as if I had not slept at all. My mind was fuzzy and was telling me that it was time to get up for work, so I hit the dismiss button and hopped in the shower. I threw on my clothes and went out the door. At work, I noticed a few people looking at me strangely, but I didn't realize, until someone pointed out to me, that my shirt was on inside out. At this point I was still working in an office, doing commodities trading, and such lapses were frowned upon. If you couldn't focus enough to put your shirt on properly in the morning, how could you focus enough to get the work done in such a demanding environment? Millions of dollars changing hands with each transaction meant that such trivial things were put under a magnifying glass, and coupled with other subsequent mistakes, each following day after that. I found myself in the boss's office by the end of the week, being handed my walking papers. Desperate for rest after days of not feeling any benefit from sleep, I went back to the casino. They knew just by looking at me how to dig their claws in further. And after a couple of hours I had managed to win myself a dream. They handed me the complimentary cocktail as they had the time before, but I hadn't realized the significance of it, and still didn't, despite the unusual vermilion color of the drink. I swallowed it in one gulp and went out the door, practically dancing and clicking my heels, ready to go home and feel rested again. My dream that night was wonderful, everything I had hoped for in many ways, but not as good as the first time. I wanted that feeling back again, knowing that it was a dream the whole time, and realizing that it was going to end seemed to shorten the fantasy, and made it seem hollow and manufactured. If I could win again, maybe it would be like that first time, I thought. The casino drew me in again and again, and I found myself a zombie most days, exhausted, at my wit's end, ready to call it quits for good and say goodbye. But then I would win again, and it would all seem to be all right for a while. My debt kept growing and growing with nearly every trip. The hypodermic needle would be plunged into my skin, and every time they had to hold me down, I would feel a little more empty each time, a little more hollow. Waking up every day began to feel the same. Nothing had definition or purpose. "You're here all the time," one of the goons whispered to me as they shot the needle into my vein the time after that. "Haven't you figured it out yet? You should just get a job here, and then at least you'll be in on the secret." I applied the next day and got an interview with the boss. I would find out later that if you got someone to apply there, you got a dream bonus. In his office, the well-dressed man was sitting behind a massive polished ebony desk. The room was adorned with paintings, sculptures, and other high-priced artwork. He had photos everywhere of himself shaking hands with world leaders, new and old, for hundreds of years, and his face never changed, never aged. "So you want to work with us? Tired of dreamless nights without end? You want to have some relief, is that it?" "Yes, please, anything. I've been coming here for so long, and it's an endless cycle. I want back what I've lost, but I keep finding myself more and more in debt with each visit." "Ah, so you understand it now then, what the injections are." It finally dawned on me, sitting there. Not injections at all. They weren't putting something in us. They were taking something out. The vermilion-colored liquid in the vials, our dreams. If I take a job with you, will the same rules apply? Will they still take my sleep, my rest, every time I lose? Yes, we can't have the employees living by different rules than everyone else, but we will give you an alternative injection so that you feel well rested when you come in for your shift. I'll do it. I need rest. I need to get some meaningful sleep. My life has been miserable ever since coming here. Well, I can't promise that this will help, he said, getting up from his desk with a hypodermic gun in his hand. The vial of fluid sitting atop this one was jet black and looked evil and poisonous. He rolled up his sleeves as he primed it, and I watched a few beads of it drip oil-like out of the tip of the needle. What the hell is that? I don't want that stuff in me. But you need to sleep, my dear worker. I can't have you passing out at the blackjack table like a narcoleptic. You agreed to this after all. You wanted to rest, and the only way for that to happen is for you to have some sort of dream. Not everyone is as lucky as you know. To have that wonderful familiar fluid in your veins, some people come to us begging to take it from them. Some of our employees, for example, the ones who do the recruitment for us, are full of this black stuff. What? I had gotten up from the chair and was backing away from him towards the door, but I found it was locked as he approached. First, you have to tell me the password, Sid. Saramth Jinn. I said the words that I had said every time to gain access to the casino, only this time I pictured the letters and rearranged them in my mind. Nightmares. He smiled as he injected me with the vial of black hate, and it went into my veins feeling hot and unpleasant. I began to sweat and the beads of it turned cold on my skin as I shivered. I'll sleep tonight. I might even wake up feeling rested. But as long as I live and work at that casino, I'll be afraid to dream again. Because now, my unconscious hours are occupied by the most terrifying experiences imaginable. Nightmares beyond imagining in their awfulness. That is my fate, unless, just maybe, I can win one more time. Reed and I were together for 5 years, but sometimes I lost track. Time flies when you're having fun, as they say. He was everything I've ever wanted in a man. Reed was handsome, patient, attentive and passionate. Recently I had the pleasure of stringing nearly 100 iterations of the word yes together, clutching my mouth, tears of joy running over my fingers. I never thought I could love as much as I love Reed. I've always dreamed of walking down an aisle of budding lilacs on a warm spring day, the wooden white chairs lining the aisle with all my friends on either side, and my mother looking on with her shimmering beautiful smile. Beyond the purple garden would be the calming rolling ocean, beating against a bright white sand beach. But as you know, love alone doesn't finance the wedding that I've fantasized about since I was a little girl. We're both still drowning in student debt, and I haven't exactly found the salary I'd expected when I graduated. But once you find your true love, you have all the time in the world. Nonetheless, Reed and I decided we should take a celebratory engagement vacation. He was under a lot of pressure after his new promotion to senior manager, and my company had just wrapped up year-end closings. So after a few weeks of my persuasive, yet probably incessant pleading, he agreed to take a late summer trip down to Georgia. I wanted to find a cozy historic Airbnb. I'd always wanted to stay in a historic home for a few nights, but probably never buy one because of the mind-numbing maintenance restrictions on updates and all other possible issues with owning one. But of course, given our financial situation, that was well off the table anyway. Our shared love of history made this an easier sell than most vacations for my stubborn fiance. We arrived starry-eyed and wildly in love in Savannah, Georgia, as young couples are. I'll preface this by saying I've never fell out of love with him, and I never will, despite all that has happened. We picked Savannah because of its rich history and colonial feel. For a week we could pretend we lived in a simpler time, or at least feel a touch of what it was like in the 19th century. The Airbnb we settled on was just off the main drag, right at the heart of the city. It was built in 1819 by a wealthy couple. The husband, Hugh John, built the home for his wife Maura. He'd made sure it was constructed to her exact specifications, down to every detail. How romantic, I said to Reed, swooning over an early 1800s love story. Don't get any ideas, Reed jested. We'd be lucky to own one bedroom by the time we're 70 at this rate. Did you see that old lady out front? What old lady? I asked. She looked at me like I had 6 heads when I unlocked the door to the house. Absolutely disgusted. What did I do? I laughed. Reed, I wouldn't overthink it too much. That was one of the things he did best. I guess it was a side effect of his deep emotional connections with people. Maybe she thought you smelled bad. He heaved out a forced laugh and shook his head. She was clearly still occupying his mind. I'll just bring everything upstairs. You get settled down here and figure out if this place has Wi-Fi. For some reason I doubt it, Reed, but I'll look around. I smiled at him over my shoulder and waved goodbye as he was leaving for work. He grabbed both our suitcases, clenched his teeth, breathed out sharply, and started up the stairs. The old wooden boards creaked beneath his heels. I secretly hoped I wouldn't find a Wi-Fi password. I just wanted us to enjoy our time together and disconnect from the world. My eyes tracked him up the winding stairs until he was out of sight. When he was gone, I did as he suggested and searched around the main floor for an owner's manual. We had only ever been in 2 rentals before, but both had some kind of guide lying around. In Nashville, a few sticky notes were pasted to the cabinets with the most beautiful handwriting I'd ever seen. The other was a glamping cabin in Pennsylvania, where the family left a laminated binder to recommend all 3 restaurants within 30 minutes, along with detailed instructions on all their smart home technologies. I walked through the living room and found very little that resembled a welcome kit. Most of what I found was vintage furniture and candle wax stains on the floor. It was strange such wealthy owners didn't take the time to repair such obvious stains, but perhaps it reminded them of the house's age, the stories it had tell, of which I admittedly knew none. I ran my fingers along the walnut end table beside the couch, my fingers collecting a dusty clump along the way. I wiped it off on the couch's arm. The house appeared even older than it was. The last thing I forgot to mention about this place was that it burned down in 1831 and was rebuilt in the exact same image of the original structure, but it took 3 years for reconstruction. So the house wasn't quite as old as advertised. I spun around the room before moving on to the kitchen. The ornate window above the front door was near the only light the house had, while the ceiling lights were still off. The sunlight illuminated dust hanging in the air, so still. I approached the fireplace, enamored by its decor. 2 dark wooden iconic columns stood at either side of the firebox. The iron bar doors twisted together in front of the charred wood. As I drew closer, I noticed the dust hanging in the air still hadn't moved, hadn't parted when I walked through it. I slowly raised a hand to test it, to see if it had shifted when I swiped at it. Suddenly I jumped and gasped. My body jolted involuntarily, and I let out a weak shriek that I momentarily wished was louder. I spun around wide-eyed and ready to strike at. "Hey, sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," Reed said with an unwelcome smile. "Did you find the Wi-Fi?" he asked eagerly. "I just finished setting us up upstairs." "No," I admitted with a sigh. I don't know. Does the air feel heavy to you?" "Heavy?" Reed snorted. "What do you mean, Laurie?" I turned all about to re-examine the dust. I couldn't see it anymore. I shook my head. "Nothing, forget it. Let's go find the welcome kit, if there even is one." Reed could tell I was upset. I saw the way his eyes scanned me, but he didn't ask. We looked through the kitchen and eventually found a dirtied post-it note that read, P@S5 word. Reed logged onto it and immediately dipped his head into his phone. I watched as his mesmerizing brown eyes glazed over against the blue glow. It ebbed and flashed as his fingers whipped over the screen. I reached out and gently covered the screen, drawing him closer with my other hand. "Hey, Reed, honey." He looked up, his eyes regaining focus. "Can we lay off the phones, just for the weekend?" "Well, I just have to check a few emails from work and make sure the team doesn't need me. We have to get a deliverable out by Monday." He started to protest. I cocked my head and grimaced. "Okay, fine, you're right. Let's just enjoy this week together." He slid his phone into his pocket and looked into my eyes the way he did when we first met. "What do you say we tour around a bit?" My grimace turned into an unavoidable smile. I nodded and took his hand. Reed always did know how to make me smile. "Let's go upstairs. The rooms are amazing." And so we did. I followed closely behind him up the winding staircase. I looked up at him, only seeing the back of his wrinkled grey t-shirt and backwards Red Sox hat. The two socks hung from the tee in Boston, and the brim was worn from constant use. Come to think of it, Reed would wear that hat more often than he'd ever wear real socks. I tried to curl my steps inward to see if I could walk without causing the floorboards to creak, but after more than a few tries I realized it was fruitless. Upstairs the air felt less dense, but maybe that was because Reed was with me. The rooms were as amazing as he suggested. The master bedroom was fitted with a large Persian red and black carpet with a twisting pattern mostly covering the oak wooden floor. The far end of the carpet disappeared underneath the low feet of the king-sized, half-tester bed frame. Sunlight peeked through the dark green drapes before Reed yanked them open to reveal the grassy square beneath. "It's beautiful," I commented. "This was really a great find." "You know me," he said. "Travel planner extraordinaire. It's an art, really." I laughed and he broke a smile. Reed wrapped his arms around me. We stood at the window and watched the busy streets below. A woman walking her dog, a man waiting impatiently to cross a street, a couple moseying aimlessly beneath the Spanish moss tree. Then I heard a creaking coming from behind us. I shuddered and tucked myself closer to Reed's side. "Did you hear that?" "It was probably just a draft," Reed soothingly replied. "Come on, let's go check it out." I reluctantly followed him away from the bedroom window towards the hall. Reed rounded the corner, outside the doorframe, and briefly zipped out of sight. And in that brief moment, something slammed shut. I stopped dead in my tracks. I tried to concentrate on my breath, control it, but it only got heavier. My skin grew clammy and most likely pale. My eyes lost focus. I attempted to utter his name, but only a whisper came out. Attempting to gather myself, I tried again. "Reed?" I called out. "What's up, Laurie?" His hatted head poked out from the doorframe. I sighed, relieved, and wiped my brow with my sleeve. "Nothing," I replied. "What is it? You've seemed on edge since we got here." I nodded, confirming his observations. It's just I've read so much about this city and how haunted it is. I guess it all really got to my head. I'm probably just being paranoid." Reed laid a hand on my shoulder and guided me out of the bedroom. "So you did psych yourself out, even when I told you not to. You know how I get with the ghost stories." "You're right, but you know there's just been so much death here. 2 bouts of yellow fever, fires, unsolved murders. You can't help but think." He gave me a stern look. "No, you're right. There are no ghosts," he said. "You'll be fine." In a way, I guess his statement still holds true. I would be fine. We reached the living room once more, and from a long day of travel and scaring myself with ghost stories on the internet, I flopped onto the couch in exhaustion. Reed still had much more energy than me and started looking for the TV remote. I'd have to concede the battle over the TV and my vendetta against electronics on vacation. I caressed the velvety carpet with my bare toes while I watched him search. Reed stuck his hand behind the television and scurried his fingers over the mantel on which it sat. His expression suddenly shifted, and he triumphantly presented the television remote and declared, "Found it!" Reed made his way to the couch without looking and instead examining the buttons on the remote, the full way over. As Reed shuffled over to the couch, his sneaker caught on a divot in the carpet. While the remote occupied one hand, his other arm flailed for balance. He fell flat on his stomach with an echoing thud. I started laughing. I couldn't help myself. "It's not funny," he winced. I tried to stop, but it was no use. My sides buckled and my eyes would hardly stay open, tearing up at the corners. I'm sorry. But I continued laughing anyway. Eventually I was able to hold my breath long enough that my laughing subsided. I looked back over to him. "Here, let me help you up." Reed shushed me. "Hold on a minute." He closed his fist and lightly hit the carpet. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. I heard it too. "It sounds hollow." Reed tossed the remote to the side, suddenly disinterested with the television. At the moment, I preferred he dove into his phone screen again. He grabbed the carpet's lining and lifted the corner. His eyes squinted, his face overtaken by wonder. He pulled it back further. "What is it, Reed?" I asked. I stood to get a better look. He didn't answer, but continued pulling. He stood from where he fell and pulled up 2/3 of the carpet, then threw it over the couch. His eyes lit up like a 5-year-old boy who'd just seen a train for the first time. "What is it?" It's... he stammered. "It's a door." I approached his side to lay eyes on his discovery. "That is so cool." His tone changed drastically. Reed knelt down and blew on the wooden floor. Dust drifted aside, and sure enough, there it was, a distinctive rectangular outline splitting the floorboard's natural pattern. A couple screws secured one side of the shape, while the other was fastened with a circular faded silver handle lying flat, nestled into a slot in the floor, in the wood. Of course, Reed's arm shot towards the handle. He stared at me deviously. "Reed, no, don't open it. You don't know what's down there." "Maybe it's where they store all the dead bodies," he jeered. "Or maybe the owner puts all their personal stuff that they don't want you or anyone else touching down there. Leave it alone," I pleaded. I frowned forcefully, putting on my best guilt-inducing expression. But it was too late. Reed was too entrenched in the idea. "Come on, Laurie. I'm not going to steal anything. I just want to have a look." "Can't you just be respectful of their place? I want to be invited back. It's beautiful here." Even as I spoke, the handle was already firmly in his grasp. "Where's your sense of adventure? I'm just going to have a peek. 5 minutes tops." I sighed. "Fine." I didn't mean it. I still wished he would just relent. Instead, Reed's smile widened. He put all his weight behind the handle and stood, pulling it from its frame. Once the door was above his shoulders, he finished the job by pushing from underneath. It creaked against its rusted old hinges until the door smacked into the floor beside it. "Reed!" I scolded. "Be careful, you're going to scratch the floor." "Sorry," he said with clenched teeth, knowing as well as I did it would leave a mark. The open floor revealed a wooden ladder. My guess is it hadn't been used in over 100 years. A step was broken in half and it swayed against the drafty air, dipping into the pitch-black nothingness beneath. I'd never seen such pure darkness. I had an unnerving hunch. Something sinister crept beneath. I tried to shake the feeling, writing it off as another incarnation of my internet ghost stories. Reed stuck a foot on the ladder's first rung to test it. He put more and more of his body weight on it until he was confident it could hold him. Appearing satisfied, he turned around to dip his torso into the hole, grabbing onto the ladder. "Read!" I pleaded once more. He looked up at me with his gleaming brown eyes. 5 minutes tops. I stepped back, oddly worried the hole would suck me in. I watched the top of his Red Sox baseball cap fade into the darkness below. His feet slapped against the wet ground beneath. An artificial light flicked on and beamed around him. He'd taken his phone out of his pocket for a flashlight. Reed looked back up at me, the baseball cap pushing into his shoulder blades. "Just so I can see, then I'll put it away, I promise." I nodded, not sure if he could detect such subtlety in my movements from 10 feet down. He either saw my nod or didn't need my approval, most likely the latter. Reed pointed his phone forwards and slid deeper into the darkness. Despite his phone illuminating his surroundings, I saw no sign of the floor that he stood on, or even what surrounded him. The light ceased only about 6 inches around him in any direction, and then silence. I couldn't tell how far he had ventured, and soon the time he'd spent down there grew hazy. My tapping foot and sweating brow all but annihilated any natural sense of time that I might have had. Where was he? How big could the cellar or whatever was down there actually be? Why didn't I even hear a peep? It was so unlike him. My mind swirled. I began to fear the worst. "Reed!" I called down, sticking my face into the foreboding hole. He didn't answer. "Reed!" I repeated. Then I heard someone running, but the steps were too light to be his. Pattering against the damp ground, splashing through each puddle, something resembling pots and pans fell. I shuddered. Giggling echoed from the hole. The giggle of a little girl. "Reed?" I called out meekly. Who was down there with him? The laugh echoed slightly louder. As scared as I was, I needed to go down looking for him. He was my fiance, and it was time to bail him out of another one of his adventures. I grabbed my phone, turned my back towards the hole, and descended the ladder. I coughed against the musty air beneath, and I took each step cautiously, each rung more obscured than the last in the thick black hole. Finally I felt the ground, soaking against my bare feet. "Ugh," I muttered to myself. I groped my pockets, trying to get a decent hold on my phone. I wrapped my fingers tightly around it to be sure not to drop it in whatever I was standing in. The screen lit up with an old selfie of Reed and I in front of the Washington Monument on a crisp spring day. I pressed the button on the bottom left of the lock screen, activating the flashlight. Just as it had been for Reed, I saw nothing beyond 6 inches in front of my face. The light swallowed by whatever lay ahead. "Reed!" I called out louder. Still no answer. Then I jumped and yelped. My heart pounded faster. The giggle echoed once more, even louder this time, all around me. I couldn't tell what direction it came from, and I was positive it wasn't Reed. "Reed, who's down there? Where are you?" Still nothing. I started to get angry with him. "Reed, answer me! Where are you? This isn't funny." No reply. I inched forwards, extending my phone out in front of me to provide better lighting, but it was useless. "Reed, where are you?" Something moderately hard hit my knee, then splashed into a puddle beside my foot. "Ow!" I yelled, but it startled me much more than it hurt. It had the texture of cloth, but heavily reinforced. I guided the phone's light down to get a better look at what it was. I gasped and tripped over my own heels. I couldn't get away from the sight fast enough. In a murky puddle beside my feet, about 6 inches deep, was his hat. That Red Sox hat floated and spun slowly in the puddle until it turned around, revealing more of a dark red than I was so accustomed to. Splotches of blood seeped down over the badge and saturated the brim. I covered my shaking lips with my free hand and began to cry. Reed, please answer me. Where are you?" I managed to utter through a shaking voice. Then the running started again. The pitter-patter of small feet darting over the wet ground grew louder. It neared me, and so did the laughing. Louder and louder it ran and pounded. I grabbed the hat and sprinted back towards the ladder. Somehow, whoever was running kept pace with me, still edging closer. I slipped my phone into the pocket, placed the hat loosely upon my head, wrapped my fingers around the rungs above my head, and my feet clamoured for a spot on the lower portions of the ladder. The faster she ran, the louder the steps. The giggling ensued. I climbed and climbed. Out of the darkness I ascended. I thrusted my right elbow over the trapdoor's frame onto the surrounding floorboards, and then the running stopped. She was here. The giggling no longer echoed as much as it resonated from beneath my feet. It was even more terrifying. Her small fingers grabbed at my ankles, long nails piercing my pant leg. I pressed my elbow harder into the oak floor for support against her pull. She couldn't pull too hard. She was no more than 10 years old. But her nails dug so deep, her giggle broke out into a demonic laugh. I kicked violently, my legs flailing. I cried out for help, not knowing who would hear. The long nails ripped at my skin, slipping downwards. The hand pulled harder, but I mustered the strength to hoist my torso over the opening and onto the floor. From there it was easier to kick, easier to break loose of the demonic girl. Her laughing turned to frustration, grunting. Finally I wiggled loose and darted from the trapdoor. I ran out the front, Reed's baseball cap still bobbing on my head. I called the police and continued running as far away as I could from that horrible house. My wet bare feet scraped against the uneven brick sidewalks, but I didn't care. The police opened a case within 15 minutes of my call, timelier than I expected. They sent a team into the house and requested I join them to point them in the right direction. I vehemently refused. I didn't want anything to do with whatever was in there. I told them about the trapdoor, about the heavy air, about the baseball cap, Reed, and the laughing girl. They took me seriously enough, as I'd expected anyone given the story. After about 10 minutes the team emerged. They all had the same look on their faces. Disappointment, awkwardly sucking their lips, avoiding eye contact. The police chief approached me, the Red Sox cap I gave him still in his hands. He haphazardly offered it back to me just before beginning to speak. "Laurie, right? Listen, we see cases like this all the time. It's a haunted town, you know? It's not that we don't believe you, we just... Won't you at least look?" I shot back. Tears still welled in my eyes. "He's my fiance, for Christ's sake." The chief nodded and his team converged around me. He continued. "That's the thing. We did look, miss. We were just in there. My boys saw the rug in the living room and looked underneath, just like you said. Laurie, the thing is, there was no trapdoor." "What?" I hissed. "Yes, there is. I know it. I saw it. I went down there. Reed is still down there with that little demon girl. You need to look for him, please." As the words came out of my mouth, I hardly believed it myself. I can't waste department time on conspiracy theories and ghost stories. You have to understand. I'm sorry. Another man on his team grabbed my hands and thrust my wrists together. "Please," I said, crying once more. He turned away and got in the driver's seat of his car. I'm out of jail now, 3 months later. Reed's parents still think I did it, but they never found any evidence other than Reed's hat. No body, no more blood, no nothing. I lost my fiancé that day, and no jail sentence would have been worse. Even though I've left that prison and Savannah altogether, my life has less meaning than it used to. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to love again. I'll always think back to that trapdoor and that bloody Red Sox cap. I'll look over our pictures sometimes, loosely capturing all the years we had together. Since losing Reed, I've wanted nothing more than answers. The Savannah PD has tried to close the case multiple times on false conclusions, but I always call back, giving them an earful about it each time. Reed Garland is still in that house, still down there with that girl. After a while, I gathered the strength to research the house we stayed in. Poring over countless articles and accounts of the house, I finally found the answers I needed. Prior to burning down in 1831, the house was a hub for the Underground Railroad. It was responsible for hiding and transporting slaves up north to freedom. The house burned down because a group of barbaric slave owners came one day looking for their property. When they arrived, the homeowners, their daughter, and the 20 slaves all descended into their secret basement, accessed through a trapdoor in the living room. The slave owners still ransacked the house until it was nothing more than charred, simmering wood littering the property. Charred wood littered the property in its place. None of the house's inhabitants ever escaped, and only a few unidentifiable corpses were found. Since then, the house was rebuilt, but that trapdoor never was. Hey there, it's me again, Miss Fearsome. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.